When I was in seminary, I lived in Dallas. And living in Dallas, there was something I learned about the houses there. And that is they all have foundation problems. In fact, I talked to a realtor once, and he told me there are two kinds of houses in Dallas. Those that have been worked on for foundation problems or have had foundation problems, and those that will. The thing is that they have clay out there, and the clay just it acts like a sponge. It absorbs water, and when it does, it expands. And when it dries up, it contracts. I remember playing softball one time, and there was a crack this big, and I'm like, I need to be careful I don't step in that and break my ankle. But the ground just does this. It just grows and shrinks. So there are two kinds of houses: those who have already had foundation problems, and those that will. The thing is when you have foundation problems, the very first clue is that you start seeing these hairline fractures in your walls, like from the corners of your doorways. And they just start spreading out further and further. But oftentimes those hairline fractures go unnoticed. You don't really see them. They're small. They're just like little lines. And the thing is but when they happen, even if you don't notice it, what's happening is your house is starting to settle. But it's very subtle. The thing is when you have foundation problems, if you catch it early enough, the people can get in there and they can shore it up and fix it and get it working right away. It's very easy, or I should say a lot easier. But they can get in there and they can fix that before you have major problems. There was one house I worked on, because I used to do remodeling and things, but there was one house we worked on, and the people, their dining room floor, they realized it was sloping, because when they started dropping things on the floor, they would roll down hill. And so we crawled underneath the house, and we found out this house was it didn't have a concrete slab, but it was a pier and beam house, so it was a wooden floor foundation that sat on top of concrete piers. And so we crawled under there, and we noticed that some of the piers over here were settling. They were dropping down in the ground. And I also noticed a little bit on the sill over here, it was the wooded rot from all the weight and all the settling and stuff, and things were crashing. So we had to jack that up and shim everything up. The problem is it would probably keep settling over time, but we fixed it at least temporarily. We jacked everything up and shimmed it up so it would stay at the right height, and we fixed the things on the ledge. But the funny thing is that then the dining room still had a little bit of a bow in it, because that wood had gotten stuck there. It had gotten used to being there. And so there was a little bit of a sponginess to the floor until that would settle back down into place and get back in its place. But this is the kind of things you can deal with when you have foundation problems. But the thing is, if you don't fix those things, they just continue to get worse. The house that Julie and I rented when we were in Dallas had huge cracks. In fact, there was paneling on the wall, and in the entryway between our kitchen and our living room, the wood paneling that was just torn apart. I mean, you could see it splintered. Not only that, there was a place in the ceiling where the ceiling went like this, and all of a sudden went whoop. It raised about 3 inches. Again, the problem here is that the ground absorbs water and grows, dries up and shrinks and pulls away from the house. And so that foundation is moving, and eventually those walls were basically falling away from the house. They were settling away from the house and falling down. The thing is when you have that kind of problem, it brings major issues. But it all started with subtle settling. And I think this pictures what happened in the life of Israel. And we will see this in the book of Judges. But I think it also is a good picture of what can happen in our lives. And when I say this, of course, I'm talking about spiritual settling. When our faith begins to slip. When we find our trust in God starting to slip. When our times of worship start to slip. And it affects our faith, it affects our obedience, it affects our devotion to God. Those things just start settling, slipping. Till one day, like that person who bought their beautiful, perfect house and finds there's cracks all over it and it's falling apart. You find yourself in a place very different than what you wanted. But it all started with just a little subtle settling. So we begin our study in Judges this morning, and we see that the Israelites started very well. Look at chapter 1 and verse 1. Judges chapter 1 and verse 1. The very beginning says, after the death of Joshua. We're going to stop right there, because this little phrase gives us a little background and reminds us how we got here. So after the death of Joshua. Now you remember that God had promised the Israelites to give them this land that they were in now. He had promised to give them this land to the Israelites. It was His land, God's land, and the current occupants, the inhabitants of the land, are under God's judgment for their sin. And so He has sent Israel in there, and He has told them, you go in and you wipe out this people because it's His judgment. They're going to carry out His judgment on these people for their sin. And He says, and you take that land, and that land is going to be yours. I'm giving it to you. And so He gives this land to Israel, but they just have to go in and take it. And He promises them that He will be with them and that He will fight for them. And we saw all this in the book of Joshua when we studied it. But here we are, and this is where we've come to. So if the people of Israel, if they were to trust God and obey Him, then they would be successful. That's what God said. I will be with you and I will fight for you. I have given you this land. So if they trust Him and obey Him, they will be successful. So Joshua led them into the land, and they took a lot of it. Not every bit of it, but they took a lot of it, and they established themselves in the land. And then Joshua took and he apportioned it all up, divided it all up, and said, okay, this part is for this tribe, and that part for that tribe. And they divided up. So each of the tribes had their own inheritance, their own land. And then when Joshua was about to die, you will remember he challenged the people. He challenged them to complete the task, and he reminded them about the promise of God and the command of God. Go take this land, and I am giving it to you. But he also warned them not to turn from God. Remember, he says, choose this day whom you will serve. And as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He challenged them not to turn from God. And in turning from God, not to pick up the sinful habits of the Canaanites who were there living in the land. And in doing so, not to start worshiping their false gods. So he warned them. And then Joshua died. And this is where the book of Judges picks up. So back again in Judges chapter 1, verse 1. It says, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? This is a great start. And we've only read one verse, but we've already read great things. Because this is a great start, because what has happened? They have done exactly what they should do. They are anxious now to obey God, to keep going, to say, okay, let's go, let's take the rest of the land like God has told us to do. But their leader has died, their human leader, so they have no more human leader. So what do? They ask God, what should we do? Who should lead us? Who should go out first? And this is so important because they know that it is only possible for them to do this task with God's help. They know that He has promised to be with them and to help them. And they want to do it God's way. They want to do it the right way. They want to live by faith. And so they ask God, who should go? Who should lead us? Well, let's keep reading. Verse 2. So, and the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. And Judah said to Simeon his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we might fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go with you into the territory allotted to you. So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand. And they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek, and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him, and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. And the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and set the city on fire. So Judah here is going out and fighting. And God has said, Judah will lead you. So Judah this is very fitting that God said Judah would lead them. Because Judah, the tribe of Judah, has been a leader in Israel going all the way back to the 12 brothers. In fact, if you remember when Jacob blessed his sons, he said that Judah would be the ruler, that he would rule over his brothers. And he talked about Judah being a warrior. So it's very fitting here that Judah would be chosen to lead the people. Not only that, but the king, David, will come from the tribe of Judah. The kings will come from the tribe of Judah. So it's very fitting here. But when God chooses Judah, he also gives the promise. He says to Judah, you go lead, and he says, I have given them into your hands. In other words, God says, it's as good as done. You go do this, it's yours, because I've done it for you. And so he says, go, just trust me and do it. And so that's what they have to do. Judah has to believe and do it. And there's something we need to catch there. It's because following God is about believing and doing. It's faith and action. You see, if Judah said, oh, I believe, but they never stepped out and went to war, what would happen? Nothing. But if they went out and did it on their own and without trusting God, what would happen? They would lose. And see, that's the life of faith. You believe and you do. And so there's two things that are required. You have to have faith and action. Well, the tribe of Judah then, they go and they ask Simeon. And here it just says Judah, Simeon, but they're talking about the tribes as a whole. But Judah asks Simeon to go and to fight with them. So they say, we're going to fight together, and you help me, and then I'll help you, and we'll do this together. And so they do. They go out and they fight together. And they go in obedience to God and in faith. And then what happened? We're told that the Lord gave them into their hand. In other words, they had total success because they trusted God and God did what He promised. We shouldn't be surprised by that. God did what He promised because God does what He promises. But there's this interesting detail that's given to us here about this defeated king or the defeated leader. Adonai-Bezek is his name. We're told that they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Now that just sounds terrible. Sounds a little bit like torture, right? They cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Now why would they do this? Now on one hand, you could say, well, it was for a very practical reason. Because in that culture, in that day, kings were warriors. In fact, many of the kings became kings or leaders because they were good in battle. They were warriors, and people just naturally followed them. He was able to lead them. He was able to win battles. He was able to protect people, and so they would naturally follow him. And so kings were good warriors. But if you cut off a king's or a warrior's big toes and his thumbs, what happens to him? He's no longer a good warrior because he's not going to have good balance without his big toes, and it's hard to hold a sword without any thumbs or a spear or any other weapon for that matter. And so he might still be able to do some, but not much. He's no longer going to be a great warrior. So on one hand, it could be a very practical reason. On the other hand, the text gives us another reason, but it actually comes from the mouth of Adonai-Bezek, the defeated king. You see, Adonai-Bezek, he was guilty of doing the exact same thing to other people. He said there were 70 kings that used to crawl around under my table. In other words, without thumbs and without toes. So he had done the same thing to many other people, and he made them crawl around, gathering scraps under his table in order to eat. He treated them like dogs. So he was very cruel to them, not only taking off their thumbs and toes, but treating them like they were inferior. And so here he is, he's very cruel, but he says that he is getting what he deserves. See, because he's saying that he sees this as God's judgment upon him. And the words he says is, God has repaid me. So he sees this as punishment that is fitting his crime. But was it right? For Judah to do this, was this right for them to do this? Or does this just give us a little hint of a problem that's happening in Israel? Has Judah taken up a Canaanite practice? I mean, we know that this king is doing it. Are they saying, hey, let's come on, let's just do like the Canaanite kings do? Have they picked up this Canaanite practice? Are they treating him just as he treated others? Moving beyond that, we also see that they allowed him to live. Now, we don't know how long he lived, and we don't know how he died, but they took him back to Jerusalem and he died there. But we also know that this king was deserving death. This man, like everyone else in that land, was deserving death and was under God's judgment. And they were not to spare him just because he was a king or had special status. But he was spared. And then he was subjected to cruel torture. Judah seems to have followed a Canaanite ethic here. Seems to have followed a Canaanite way of thinking, a way of doing things rather than God's. So is this some subtle settling that we're seeing in the people of Judah and the people of Israel? Well, verse 8 just gives us a real quick summary of the next battle. They go up and take Jerusalem, and it suggests that they won this quickly, they won it easily, and decisively. Let's keep reading in verse 9. It says, and afterward, the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negev, and in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba, and they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sepher. And Caleb said, he who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him Achsah, my daughter, for a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, and he gave him Achsah, his daughter, for a wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field, and she dismounted from her donkey. And Caleb said to her, what do you want? She said to him, give me a blessing. Since you have set me in the land of the Negev, give me also springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And so here we have this report of the continuing conquest of the land. And it's very positive. He's just telling us all the good things that are happening, how they're being successful. And so the people of Judah here are trusting God, and they're acting upon his promises, and they're being successful. But then we're told about Caleb. Do you remember Caleb? Remember who Caleb is? He was one of the 12 spies that had gone into the land many years before. In fact, he was one of the 2 spies who came back and gave a good report. And Caleb came back and he said, let's go. God is going to give us the land. The other 10 said, no way, the people are huge. They'll destroy us. Caleb said, what did God promise? He said he'd give it to us. He'll give it to us. Let's go. So Caleb was a man of faith, both then and now. But Caleb said, let's go. And so because of his faith back in the day, Moses had promised to give him a certain section of land. We know it as Hebron. And then Joshua, when they came into the land, he broke up the allotments, he allotted that land for Caleb and said, this is your land that was promised to you by Moses. Well, now this city is known as Kiriath Arba, which means city of Arba. Now, back in Joshua chapter 14, verse 15, it tells us that that Arba was the greatest of the Anakites. And the Anakites are those giant men who the 10 spies were so afraid of. And so Caleb now is going in and taking that city, the city that belongs to the greatest of those giant men that the Israelites were afraid of. And so here again we see that Caleb, the man of faith, then and now, he believed God would keep his promise. And he went into battle and he took it and he renamed the place Hebron. And the renaming of this city shows that there has been a complete change of ownership. That Caleb now owns this town, that Israel owns this town, that God has given his faithful people this land just as he promised. And again, we need to catch this. See, God does what he says he will do. When God promises, there is no doubt that he will do it. He does what he says he will do. And we have no reason not to trust him. Well, in these verses, we also were given some specific details about Caleb and his daughter. And Caleb basically said, whoever goes in and captures this city can marry my daughter. Now, it would be very easy for us to read this and just read this as a daughter being used as a pawn or just some prize in this male-dominated society to get what the men want. It'd be very easy for us to read it that way, but that isn't exactly what's happening here. In fact, there's much more happening here, and I don't believe his daughter would have thought of it that way either. You see, Caleb is actually doing something good for his daughter here. He is actually ensuring that his daughter will have a worthy husband. Because this man who's going to actually go up and take this city will be awarded her hand in marriage. But that makes sure that his daughter has a worthy husband, one who is brave, one who is strong, one who is a man of faith, just like Caleb is. Because in order for him to go in and take the city, he has to trust God and believe the promise of God. So a man of faith. A man who will provide and protect his daughter. And so Caleb here is ensuring that his daughter will have a worthy husband. And so he's actually being a caring father here, looking out for the good of his daughter. Caleb could have just gone and taken the city himself. But he's looking out for the good of his daughter. And so as the story continues, after they're married, she comes to him and she asks for a blessing. She specifically asked for some springs to go with the land that he's given her. You see, because basically she's saying, I've got this field, but I need water. I need water to drink, maybe for the animals. I need water to grow food. I need water. And so what does Caleb do? He gives her these two springs. Now it's interesting in verse 14. It says, when she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. Now, it almost sounds like she's urging her husband to ask for the field. But I think we need to read this a little different. The word urged here, we take it in the sense of charmed. Like she charmed him in order to ask him. It's kind of like she buttered up her daddy. She came to him and she said, Daddy, you gave me a field, but I need some water. And so like she buttered up, as only a daughter can, buttered up her dad and said, can I get some water? And Caleb, you see that when she comes, it says she charmed him to ask him. And he says, right away, he says, what do you need? What do you want? And then he gives it to her. You see, he loves her and he quickly asks, what do you want? And gives her what she needs. But with all the success stories that we've read here, as you continue reading the following verses, you find a couple not so successful undertakings mixed in. And some cracks are starting to show. Look at verse 16. It says, and the descendants of the Kenites, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms in the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negev near Arad. And they went and settled with the people. Now, this is just a reminder about the Kenites. The Kenites were the family of Moses' wife. And if you remember back in the book of Numbers, Moses asked them to come with the people of Israel because the Kenites, they knew the land, they knew the best places to camp, best places to find water, and those kinds of things. And so he asked them to come with them and help them through the wilderness. And he promised them that whatever good God gave them, that they would do good to them as well, to the Kenites as well. So whatever God gave them, they would be able to share in the land that God would give them. And I believe it's mentioned here, the Kenites are mentioned here, probably to let us know that Moses' promise was fulfilled. Because we've already seen that God keeps his promises, but we also know that God's people keep their promises as well. We'll keep reading verse 17. It says, and Judah went with Simeon, his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and devoted it to destruction, so that the name of the city was called Hormah. Judah also captured Gaza and its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak. And the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. So here we have a mixture of good and bad news. We have some success and some failure. But you notice here when it was talking about the tribe of Judah going in and taking the hill country, it says what? It says the Lord was with Judah. So they took the hill country. And then what's it say right after that? But they could not take the plains. Now that should stand out to you as something sounding very odd. Because the Lord was with them, so they took the hill country, but they could not take the plains. Why couldn't they take the plains? Well, it says because they had chariots. And I want to say, wait a minute. Are you saying that chariots defeated God? Are you saying that God is not powerful enough to beat an army that has chariots, that has superior weaponry? But God said He was with them, so there must be something else going on here. It's going to become clear later. But here, we're just given the people's perspective. We couldn't win because they had chariots. But see, what was happening is they were trusting God in the hill country. Because chariots can't run around in the hill country. So they said, hey, they don't have chariots here. And they were trusting God to defeat them there. But when they got out into the plains, they're like, they have chariots. And they quit trusting God. Well, then we're reminded of Caleb's success, followed by the tribe of Benjamin's failure. So Caleb took his cities, and Benjamin was not able to drive out the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, just in case you caught this and you're wondering about it, we just read a few minutes ago that Judah had conquered Jerusalem. But now we're told that Benjamin was not able to conquer Jerusalem. And if you know the Old Testament, you know in Samuel, David will go in and will conquer Jerusalem and drive the Jebusites out of Jerusalem. So what's going on here? Because it seems like conflicting stories. Well, it appears that we have a case of where Judah came in and conquered, and then when they went away, the Jebusites came back in and took over the city again, and then the Benjamites came in again later to try and conquer and could not. Because if you remember during the conquest, when the Israelites were coming in, they couldn't immediately live in every single town that they conquered because they were fighting battles. So they would go and they would fight their battles and fight and then fight, and then they would come in and they would settle into those towns. So somewhere in there it appears that when one conquered and then they went away and continued fighting the battle, someone else came in and took the city over, and the Jebusites came, and then later on Benjaminites come and they try to take it and they aren't able to. But the point here is that the Benjamites failed. They came to take the city and they failed. God had said, go and take it and I will give it to you. But they went and they failed. You see, the cracks in Israel's faith are starting to show. God had promised, and we know that there is no weakness in God. So why did they fail? Well, maybe you're thinking at this point, well, these are just small cracks, just a couple small failures. But the thing is that small cracks become major issues. Look at verse 22. It says, the house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you. And he showed them the way into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city, and he called its name Luz. That is the name to this day. Now, we read this story, and on the surface I'd say it looks like a success. But was it? In fact, as you read this story, it sounds somewhat familiar or similar to the story of Jericho and Rahab. You got spies who go in and meet someone who helps them, and and then the city is actually captured. But the details of these two stories are actually quite different. See, if you remember in Jericho, what happened? The spies went in and they slipped into Rahab's home just to kind of to try and be unnoticed. But then the leaders of the town came to Rahab's home because they heard that these men had come. And they came to her home, and when they came to her home, she voluntarily decided to risk her life to hide these men from the leaders of her city. But why did she do it? It's because she believed in the power of God. In fact, she believed and she declared that God, this was her words, that God was the God of heaven and earth. And she believed that He would give Israel the victory. So as a result of her declaration about God, and because of her help, they promised to do good to her. And then God Himself knocked down those walls. After the Israelites came, they walked around those walls 7 times, and what happened to the walls? They fell in. They didn't do it. God did it. God Himself knocked down the wall, and then they won the victory there. And it was very obvious that God had won that victory for Israel. Then following that, when Rahab is saved and brought out, she comes and she assimilates into Israel. She becomes one of God's people. Now let's talk about what happened here at Bethel. The spies go and they see an opportunity. They find a Canaanite man and they cut a deal with him. They say, tell us how to get into the city and we'll treat you well. There's no profession of the greatness of God. There's no recognition in this man that God is the God of heaven and the earth. There's no recognition of God at all. And see, rather than trusting God, the Israelites trust a Canaanite. And this man helps them. And by his help, he probably assumes that they won the battle. Why? Because he helped them. I told them how to get in. And it leaves open that question. How did the Israelites win this battle? Was it because God was with them? Or was it because this man helped them? This sinful man. And then they let this man live. Not because he believed in God, but because they owed him. He runs away. And what's he do? He establishes a new town, a new godless city, and he calls it Luz. The same name as the old city, which then makes it, well, did the city get conquered at all, or did it just move? So on the surface, this looks like a success, but it is actually a failure of faith. You see, they put their trust in a sinful man rather than in God. Keep reading, verse 27. It says, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shan and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in the land. It's almost like as the people failed, the Canaanites became obstinate, and they said, we're not going anywhere. They persisted in dwelling in the land. Verse 28, when Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. That's interesting too, because it doesn't say this tribe, when this tribe became strong, but when all of Israel became strong, then they were able to put these people to forced labor. Verse 29, and Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Acco or the inhabitants of Sidon or of Alab, or of Akzib, or of Helbah, or of Arphik, or of Rehob. I'm getting tired of reading places that they did not conquer. And the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth-Anath. So they lived among the Canaanites in the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh and Beth-Anath became subject to forced labor for them. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Heres, in Ajalon, and in Shalabim. But the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Now, did you notice as we read through this? They could not, they did not, they could not, they did not. In other words, they failed. God had promised them so much more. But they settled for a little. And because they didn't trust God and move forward in faith and do this, some of the sinful Canaanites stayed there in the land. And we're told that they were still in the land. They persisted in the land, meaning they were still there. So they were living, not necessarily living together, but near each other. But then as we continue on, it gets worse. Because then it says the Canaanites lived among them. And we hear that in a couple places, that these Canaanites lived among the Israelites. In other words, with them in the same space. Then as you continue reading, we heard that the Israelites were living among the Canaanites. Now that just turns things around here. What's that suggest? If they're living among the Canaanites, whose land is it? Who's in the position of power? Who's in the position of control? This is God's land, not the Canaanites' land. But here they are living among the Canaanites, and it suggests that the Canaanites are in control, that it's their land. And then finally we read about Dan. And Dan isn't able to defeat the Amorites. In fact, the Amorites come and they drive Dan out of their land. And they say, no, you can't come here. In fact, later you'll find out that Dan, they just pick up and move north. They don't even stay where they're at because they're not able to. In the story of Dan, we have just a complete failure. Now, God keeps His promises, and God is not weak. So what's the source of the problem? Well, we're going to read it here in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. It says, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. God doesn't break His promises. Verse 2, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a snare to you. If you remember, that was another promise of God. If they failed to obey, and they failed to do this, that this would happen to them. Verse 4, as soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they called the name of the place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. So God sends a message to the people of Israel. And the message is very clear. You didn't lose these battles because they had chariots. You didn't lose these battles because they were superior warriors. You lost these battles because you failed to obey me. You didn't move forward in faith. You didn't trust me. You didn't obey me. You didn't do the things that I had told you to do. You see, they didn't trust God and do what He said. When things got difficult, they settled. They compromised. He said, you're not to go in and make covenants with these people. Well, what did they do? They went in and they made agreements with people. They trusted sinful man rather than God. They made agreements with these people. They settled down with these people. They were to tear down their altars, but they didn't. They allowed this idolatry to continue on in God's land. They became tolerant of the Canaanite ways. And in a sense, it seems that they became desensitized to it. Like it's just, well, that's just what they do. They became desensitized to the evil practices around them, and in some cases even assimilated into them. So then rather than having a purifying effect on that land, and rather than having a purifying effect on that culture, they just joined in the sin. But what's great about these verses is their response to the message from God. And it's one of the few times we're going to see a very positive response to the message of God in the book of Judges. But they respond well. They recognize their sin, and they are sorry for their sin. And they repent, and we're told that they worship God. They sacrifice to God. They're repenting of their sin and worshiping God. You see, God is faithful. God is good, and He keeps His promises. And God's people are to be faithful to Him, to trust Him, to obey Him, to follow Him. And as God's people, we are to be distinctive, different. Not different just for the sake of being different, not different just because to be weird or because we're a spectacle, but different because we're to be like our God. And as Christians today, as God's people today, we're not called to carry out God's judgment like Israel was. We're not called to go in and take this land and wipe everyone out. We're not called to carry out God's judgment. God hasn't called us to drive people out. He's called us to bring people in. To call to people, to reach out to people. Not drive out, but reach out. And say, let me tell you about my God. Let me tell you how you can be saved. Let me tell you how you can have true life. But we are still called to be distinct. You see, we are God's people, and we are to be holy as He is holy. We are to live by faith. And so that means that we are to live in this world alongside sinners and yet be different. And sometimes this can be hard. Sometimes it can be hard to do, to be different, to be amongst sinners and yet be different, to stand up for what you know and what you believe and to live like Jesus. But God has promised that He will work in us. He has promised. He's given us a Spirit. And Galatians says, you walk by the Spirit and you will not fulfill the desires of the flesh. God has promised that He will work in us. And if He has promised, then He will do it. And that means that we can do it if we live by faith. But it also can be hard because sometimes we fall victim to subtle settling. To living in the world's ways rather than in God's ways. And those things can happen very subtly. And sometimes they happen without us even realizing it. Like those fine cracks in people's house walls. You don't even notice it. But there's settling happening. And I think this is a challenge for us to think about. A couple of examples. At what point do you move from living in the world next to people who don't yet know Jesus? What point do you move from just living amongst those people to aligning with them, to thinking the way they think, to embracing their idols? At what point do you move from enjoying God's blessings to being materialistic? At what point do you move from taking pride in your work to becoming prideful and arrogant? At what point do you move from enjoying creative things like the arts and movies and music to doing the opposite of what Job says and setting evil things before your eyes? Or before your ears, or before your heart. You see, I think we need to think about these things. I think we need to pray to God and search our hearts and search our motives. And why do we do the things that we do? And what do we put our trust in? What are we putting our faith in? What are the things that we are attached to? What are we giving ourselves to? And as you pray and ask God and search your heart, if you find that there are things that you are settling, there are ways that you are compromising, then confess that and ask God to help you get it right. You see, every day the world offers us its values. Every day the world offers us its ways. Every day the world offers us its sins. Every day the world offers us its idols. And I'm going to tell you that Satan is deceptive. And so you may not even notice when you begin to settle, when you begin to compromise, when you start to slip and settle into the world's ways. But if you are a child of God, that makes you different. So keep your mind set on His promises and guard your heart and live by faith.